the substances that tend to be extremely effective at treating trauma are also the ones that make you feel really good. And it turns out if you put people in a state where they feel really good, and then you, in a caring, supportive way, guide them through processing trauma, all of a sudden they can tolerate it, right? It's more complex than that, but really I think part of what people are afraid to name is that this works because of pleasure, because you can all of a sudden sustain a relationship to things that you had to previously totally dissociate from.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosophers. Today's guest on The Erotic Philosopher is Goldpaugh. Dee is a psychotherapist and clinical supervisor in private practice, specializing in sex and relationship therapy, trauma, spirituality, and psychedelic integration psychotherapy. They're also a member of the Woodstock Therapy Center ketamine-assisted psychotherapy team. Dee has written and presented widely on the topic of psychedelics and sexuality, queer identity, trauma, spiritual practice, and pleasure. Dee is the Community Support and Integration Director of the Hudson Valley Psychedelic Society and has a clinical training background in sex therapy, EMDR, internal family systems therapy, and psychodynamic psychotherapy. They're an artist and a musician and have additional training in shamanic healing and bioregional herbal medicine. Dee's approach to psychotherapy embraces body and sex positivity and spiritual growth as tools for self-actualization. Enjoy today's discussion with Dee Goldpaugh. Dee, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher.
Thank you for having me, Cindy.
It's really great to see you, and I'm thrilled to catch up with you. I haven't seen you in person for a number of years, obviously because of COVID notwithstanding. And now that things are somewhat going back to, I don't want to say normal, but returning to, an in-person world again a little bit. I'm hoping to cross paths with you again at some point in the future. But for people, Dee, who have never met you, who know very little or nothing about you, what would you like people to know about you?
Oh, well, I will first say that when you reached out to me to be on the podcast, I had sworn off podcasts. I was like, I'm not doing any more projects. I'm so busy right now. But you can't say no to Cindy Darnell. I mean, of course you can. You can consent and everything, but I wouldn't because I love you. So here I am. So yes, thank you for having me. My name is Dee Goldpaugh. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I am a queer, non-binary psychotherapist in private practice in Woodstock, New York. I used to have a New York City presence, but I have gravitated north as many people did in pandemic.
A lot of people did, especially during COVID. So you're not in the city at all anymore?
I still have a practice presence in the city because I work with a therapist team of other wonderful therapists, and they're based in New York City. But I've been solely practicing in Woodstock for the past 2 years now. Yeah. So I had been already a half-timer up here for many years. So this was just like a change that was already in progress. But yeah.
And so I think, I met you through mutual connections and friends and acquaintances, but also where I really became aware of your expertise and your extraordinary work, not just in New York, but in the US and I think, in the world at large, that your knowledge and your specialty area around therapy and sexuality and psychedelics and the integration of these three aspects towards healing, towards well-being, towards self-discovery, towards, trauma management, all these kinds of things. So let's start with your own journey, either personal or clinical or a little bit of both, and how it is that you came to be a person with such a rich understanding of the relationship between psychedelics
and the therapeutic world and healing?
Yeah. Well, so, my personal journey really started because I was a traumatized person myself. And I've been very, very upfront about that in my writing and in my teaching. Am a survivor of sexual trauma, and I had treatment resistant PTSD. I struggled for many years. I had all kinds of therapy, but frankly, mostly talk therapy that I honestly, in retrospect, believe really did not help, right? It was really, really not effective. In fact, re-traumatizing. And I eventually found my way to psychedelic healing. I was very lucky to be able to have gone to Peru. I worked with people who were extremely trustworthy, with a lot of integrity, and was really able to change my life in dramatic ways through that work. I had already been interested in psychedelics sort of clinically, but it was really through this personal experience that I came back and just refocused my career on psychedelic healing. I had already been interested in sort of working around gender and sexuality, which was a lot of the work that I had already been doing. I had been, working in the LGBT community for years before I had all of these experiences. But then, I began to see some really crucial and interesting things that I did not think were really in the conversation about psychedelics and sexuality. So I think to sort of understand that, you have to understand a little bit about the context of psychedelics in science and in therapy today.
Right. Okay, so let's get into that.
Yeah. So, obviously, there's still a lot of cultural associations with psychedelics, with the sort of free love of the 1960s and counterculture. And, despite the fact that I'm personally immersed in a world of psychedelic therapy where this is all kind of being held in clinical contexts, or certainly like shamanic contexts that I've been in, all you have to do is like read the comments section whenever the New York Times does an article about psychedelics for me to realize many people still associate them with like, you're going to take LSD and jump out a window type of kind of fears. So, the Controlled Substances Act, without getting into the whole history of the drug war and how we got where we are, which is a whole conversation in and of itself, in broad strokes, you have this legal backlash to the kind of movement of the 1960s. The Controlled Substances Act comes along in the 1970s and really brings a halt to any kind of research around psychedelics. Psychedelics are now underground, illicit, and illegal. So people who use them are now criminals, right? It creates a really different kind of resonance in society. And of course, the media is mostly focused on all the terrible things that can happen with psychedelics. So really everything freezes in terms of psychedelic research until the 90s, and then it slowly starts to creep in with privately funded research that's happening in little dribs and drabs. And this eventually sort of begins to snowball into the situation we have today, which I think also has its own perils, which is this idea of like pharmaceutical companies are vastly investing in psychedelic products. There is sort of a feeling that you can find a psychedelic cure for anything. And I think that has its own kinds of danger involved in it. I say all of this because the moment that we're in psychedelic healing in the clinical context has had to situate itself as a very serious, science-based treatment modality that is focused on treating mental health conditions. What it is not focused on is fun, pleasure, restoring erotic energy or life force, all of the things that I think psychedelics can do best. So, I am definitely part of the clinical psychedelic arena, right? I'm not against psychedelic assisted therapy at all. I am a ketamine assisted psychotherapist. So I believe in this very strongly as a treatment modality. But where I thought I could contribute a voice to the field that I saw being very underrepresented is that, yes, psychedelics in a clinical context are great and really can revolutionize the way we're delivering mental health treatment. But psychedelics are also vehicles of great joy, pleasure, eroticism, and community, frankly.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And that sort of breadth of understanding that you have, and that you said, you've sort of experienced it firsthand yourself through your own work, your own interactions in different formats. And, I think the word that really stood out to me most in what you were saying was that your experiences were imbibed with integrity, and how important it is that when we are seeking practitioners to take us on these journeys, or to facilitate these journeys for us, or to take us into these parts of ourselves, whether it is in a more clinical context or a more kind of recreational context, integrity matters so much. And because you're saying, that we have this, certainly the media create this perception of drug use, psychedelic use, because it's considered a criminal activity, and yet it has the capacity to create so many opportunities for healing for us. How can we? Do we know how do we know how this works? Do we have any sense of how psychedelics work in terms of how they facilitate an opening up to parts of us that are probably already there, but are somehow dormant, or, dare I say, locked up?
Yeah, it's a complicated question to answer because, frankly, scientists are still trying to understand the mechanisms of what psychedelics do in our brain that causes these discrete effects that seem to help people. We have a lot of speculation about, what parts of the brain are affected and exactly in what way, and how that seems to create certain reliable effects that improve people's mental health. But if I were to speak more to the experiential side of it, psychedelics they don't heal all in the same ways, but there are certain broad strokes that we can look at about, like, how do they seem to affect people so positively? And for certain psychedelics, like specifically psilocybin mushrooms, I was just reading a statistic yesterday. I was preparing for a class I'm about to teach, and more people have been clinically treated with psilocybin mushrooms for depression in research studies than they have for certain FDA-approved medications for depression at this point.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's incredibly studied. We know exactly what psilocybin does in terms of its experience. And at higher doses, what research is sort of upholding is that when you have a certain qualitative experience with psilocybin at what we would call a relatively high dose level, it can occasion a mystical experience. So what I mean by that is an experience of ineffability, of boundlessness, of connection to beings and phenomena, right? Like this mystical quality. And that mystical quality seems to be correlated to not only a remission of depressive symptoms, but a sustained remission of depressive symptoms. It seems to work for extended periods of time. So what's unique about this is, rather than having to take a medication like an SSRI on a repeated basis that will decrease your symptoms, but can also lead to, all kinds of negative side effects, including sexual ones, psilocybin at a high dose in a clinical context seems to have persistent positive impacts when paired with supportive psychotherapy.
That is just fantastic. It makes me so excited when I hear you talk about things like this, that this research that's coming through is, very, very strongly in the affirmative. So let's talk now about how we can blend the art and practice of psychotherapies with these mystical experiences. So it's not like the clients are tripping in your presence necessarily, right? Or perhaps it is it not? How does it work?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So I think the answer lies in what type of therapeutic approach we're talking about, because what you'll see a lot of, or it's certainly a growing discipline, is people providing psychedelic integration therapy. And what that means is that the therapist is working inside of their legal scope of practice. They're not administering a psychedelic. They're not telling a client they should take psychedelics, nor are they connecting them to psychedelics directly outside of their practice. But what they are doing is working with people who have had psychedelic experiences, who need the therapeutic support to really create the glue in their life so that the experience has lasting meaning for them. So again, integration therapy is a legal practice that falls under the umbrella of integrative harm reduction. And the therapist is just working with clients around their previous experiences. I also get a lot of folks contacting me saying, I'm about to go to Peru. I'm going to do ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru. Can you help me prepare for this? So we're looking at, preparation beforehand and integration afterwards, but the therapist not being involved with any illegal activity, which unfortunately administering psychedelics outside of research context still is. The exception to that is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Ketamine is grouped in with psychedelics, but it is not properly a psychedelic. It's a legal substance that has been used as an anesthetic since the 1960s. And at certain doses, ketamine can have an incredibly psychedelic-like or transpersonal type of experience with its administration. It also has incredibly rapid onset antidepressant qualities. So it was first being looked at for mental health with suicidal individuals as a triage type of treatment, because it can, in as little as one dose, take a person from suicidal thoughts and feelings to stability. So what we found with ketamine was with repeated administrations, it seems to have a longer tail, meaning the antidepressant effects last longer. And when paired with psychotherapy, people can have access to working through material that was previously intolerable. So that is a legal type of psychedelic therapy that I currently do, is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So a doctor evaluates the client, oversees the medical part of the treatment, and a therapist is present for the therapeutic support. So, yeah.
And so when you say being able to sort of, to tolerate these what were once intolerable feelings, that it somehow dampens the intensity of what, we might be experiencing, if it is working through some traumatic historical thing, or working through some sort of complex, unresolved emotional stuff, that with the assistance of this chemical effect in our system, it makes it easier for us to be able to talk about it without the sting and the intensity of feeling like we're, sinking down or losing our grip on being able to stay with something. So it helps us be more present, right?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And what's really interesting, if you want to get into the trauma piece of this, is that the medicines that have shown the best efficacy for treating PTSD, which is, first of all, MDMA. I mean, MDMA is incredibly close to being rescheduled as a prescribable substance to treat PTSD, probably within the next 2 years. And ketamine is also being looked at for the treatment of PTSD, along with different kinds of therapeutic interventions. We see less research looking at the treatment of PTSD with what we would call the classic psychedelics, like psilocybin or LSD. And why is that? The substances that tend to be extremely effective at treating trauma are also the ones that make you feel really good. Because like an LSD trip can be really intense and interesting and fruitful, but a lot of people don't describe it as pleasurable, right? They might say it's intense, it was spiritual, it was all these wonderful things, but not necessarily ecstatic. But the substances that have gotten bad reputations as party drugs or drugs of abuse, like ecstasy, MDMA, or ketamine, Special K, they're the ones that make you feel really good. And it turns out if you put people in a state where they feel really good, and then you, in a caring, supportive way, guide them through processing trauma, all of a sudden they can tolerate it. right? It's more complex than that, but really I think part of what people are afraid to name is that this works because of pleasure, because you can all of a sudden sustain a relationship to things that you had to previously totally dissociate from.
Right. So when we bring pleasure forward, it makes those intolerable feelings easier to manage and easier to deal with. So when we understand this, when we know this, what do you think is the among professionals, among clinicians, what do you think is contributing to so much of the resistance around not only kind of legalizing or decriminalizing this as part of an integrative therapeutic process, but why is it also that do you think it's looked down upon? Is it do you think because of the criminal connection? Because historically it's been, America's war on drugs that has made it like so dangerous?
That is an incredibly complex question. And it's really getting to the heart of like, why are we where we are with psychedelics, right? So let me try to like piece this apart a little bit. I think that if you look at the clinical literature, the one word you will never see anywhere is pleasure, right? Because we're trying to really put things in this credible, accessible, scientifically valid framework, right? And I think this is an important aside, but I want to answer your question directly, but as just a little side piece that I think is incredibly important to mention is that, the healing that I experienced for my PTSD did not happen in a therapeutic context. It happened in a shamanic context. And it happened with a medicine called San Pedro, which is a traditional medicine used in the Andes. And it's a mescaline-containing cactus, very similar to peyote. And, the discrete effects of San Pedro are not about confronting trauma necessarily, or at least I could speak to my experience. It wasn't about confronting traumatic material. It was actually just about feeling the absence of a traumatic somatic response in my body, which felt amazing, right? I could feel my whole body. I could feel connected to what was around me. I had access to so much heart space. At no point in any of those ceremonies was I being confronted with traumatic material. It was like, oh, this is what it feels like to regain access to what I lost in childhood through these traumas that I experienced. So, that is not a paradigm that we necessarily bring into the clinical context of healing. Like, is it possible to heal in different ways without having to go through these confrontations of traumatic material? So what I've noticed from different clinicians that seem to be very skeptical of psychedelics, what seems to be in there is a lot of skepticism of any kind of relief that is not attained through extremely hard work, right? Like that there's something that's insincere about having healing that is assisted in some way. And, this is my personal opinion on that. I think we still have a lot of deeply puritanical roots in this society that, has a lot of skepticism towards anything that puts people into a direct relationship with the divine without any kind of mediation, puts people into a direct relationship with their body and feeling good. I think, also substance abuse treatment and training in this country is not very trauma informed either. I was just giving a talk yesterday about this topic, and the fact is most people who abuse substances of any sort, and when I say abuse, which is a loaded word, I simply mean have a relationship to any substance that is not working for them in their life. Between 60 and 90% of those people are traumatized, right? And we tend to want to focus very much on the substance using behavior and not on the circumstances or context and not on the trauma, right? The emphasis in our training in society is stop the person from using drugs, not look at how this substance is making it possible for them to live their life, right? Whether that's blunting out feelings that they can't tolerate or whether it's giving them feelings of pleasure. So yeah, it's a little bit, I'm answering your question in a little bit of a convoluted way. So
No,
part
no,
one of
because
this,
yeah.
go ahead. I'm sorry. Did you want to say
No,
something?
it's because I think you really hit the nail on the head there, because it is a convoluted thing. And the fact that, how, especially in traditional psychotherapy, we are trained, like bloodhounds, to look for problems. Like, where's the source of pain? Where's the trauma? Where's the angst? Where's the memory of the person who did the horrible thing to you and all this stuff? And we're in there like hounds, just, where is it? And this is how we're trained. But then, when we're out of school and out of training and, in sessions with clients and certainly in my experience, I've learned far more by being in the chair with my clients than I ever learned at school. And my clients still to this day teach me so much in my context, probably more about sex than anything else. But hearing and being with them energetically, not physically, being energetically with them in that sort of therapeutic relationship allows us to be able to, to orient towards pleasure, and not necessarily always be looking for where's the pain, why are you feeling this pain? If only I knew why I was so fucked up, I would feel so much better. And I agree that certainly in the somatic sex therapy, that is where my area of research is, how much we can access and how much we can move through when we allow clients to feel those parts of themselves that had been masked by pain, that had been masked by, whatever horrible stuff had happened to them, that we don't necessarily have to start from the, tell me about your father thing, but more about, tell me what feels good. Tell me, what's it like when you remember feeling these ecstatic feelings. And that's not a cognitive process. That's a nervous system process. It's a somatic process. It's a spiritual process. It's something that is so overlooked in psychotherapeutic training, to the point that I do, like you, I even doubt the point of psychotherapy, talk-based psychotherapy at times, because in my experience, it just doesn't go deep enough. It doesn't get to the root of what people are coming to us for.
I think talk psychotherapy has a strong place through the means of the therapeutic relationship. I think I see a talk therapist right now who I think is a fantastic therapist and has helped me tremendously because of the nature of our relationship with each other, right? It's not, and I wonder, though, if I would be benefiting from the talk therapy I had now had I not had these experiences or these somatic kind of processes previously, because obviously talk therapy got me absolutely nowhere when I was in an acutely traumatized state. So
that's an interesting distinction then, that, the level of self-knowledge and the level of self-awareness that you're now bringing to the therapeutic relationship has altered your experience of it, that when you've got more to bring, when you've got more to show up with, you're going to have a richer relationship with it. But perhaps somebody, or in your case, in your story, prior to having the knowledge of yourself that you have now, you found that the talk-based relationship was not as fulfilling, was not as rich for you as it could have been, or as it is now, because of what you've learned about yourself through your own experiences with psychedelic medicine.
Yeah. Well, I think all therapists, for the most part, are incredibly well-intentioned. But what we know is that making someone talk about traumatic experiences over and over generally doesn't help them to heal. It can be incredibly re-traumatizing. So I do want to pull another thread from your question, which is sort of looking at this whole perspective of why we are where we are from a different lens. And that is the presence of pharmaceutical companies in the psychedelic space. And I think that you can't have this conversation without thinking about how in the past 2 years, I would say, this is like a very recent churn of events, the majority research that I am seeing come out in the field, really interesting research too, is not being conducted anymore academically. It's being conducted by pharmaceutical companies because it is a race right now to develop patentable synthetic molecules that are, synthetics of naturally occurring psychedelics Most, but not all companies have very little awareness or attempt at any kind of meaningful indigenous reciprocity, because guess what? White people didn't invent any of this, right? These medicines, for the most part, with the exception of LSD, ketamine, ones that were sort of laboratory inventions of the 20th century. These medicines have traditional roots that go back for centuries, right? So like, we're not inventing any kind of protocol. We're building on the work of Black and brown women largely, but certainly indigenous elders of all around the world who have used these medicines, in some cases going back for centuries. So you have this really interesting moment where pharmaceutical companies, for this to be profitable, they need to make sure you think there's something wrong with you, and they need to be able to sell you something at a very high cost. Because let's face it, if you aren't going to take a pill every day, and you're going to have a treatment that you only have to do a few times, it's going to have a big price tag, right? So I'm not saying that every company out there in the psychedelic space is completely mercenary. I think there are some good ones that are really trying to look at health equity and really trying to look at underrepresentation of queer and trans folks in studies, underrepresentation of Black and indigenous folks in studies, and sort of rectify those things. Yet there's definitely a shift in the community towards clinicalizing these medicines, looking at them as their only valid application is in a clinical context. And I think that is both dangerous and inaccurate, because recent peer-reviewed studies show that psychedelics being used in naturalistic settings, which means at home with your friend or out in nature, seem to have a pretty damn good track record of also being antidepressant, of reducing problematic substance use, of lessening symptoms of trauma. So, these medicines are powerful, and certainly there's going to be some people that a clinical context is the best place for them. They are treating a specific mental health issue and they need the specific therapeutic support. But I actually think like the bigger picture here is that if we think this clinical, it's the word I'm looking for, this absolute blossoming of clinical research and practice, which I think is fundamentally good, if it's not paired with justice measures like decriminalization, to me, it's very hollow, right? Because this is going to go the way of just more patentable substances that you could be sold. And, I think like a piece that has to be talked about, if we care about trauma survivors, if we care about pleasure, if we care about autonomy, is that these substances need to be decriminalized, right? We have to stop putting primarily Black and brown people in jail for drugs, period.
Right. And that's the thing. And then, with that decriminalization piece makes me think, of course, about sex work and the relationship around sex and pleasure. And again, we're coming back to this idea that, pleasure-centered interventions, let's not call them therapies, but pleasure-centered interventions really disrupt the status quo of accessibility, money, legislation, all of those things, and that's really going to potentially alter how we, from a community health point of view, perhaps look at the impact of pleasure as a healing tool outside of clinical settings. So, Didi, as we sort of start wrapping up this conversation, because I really could sit and talk with you for hours, what's your vision of your work and the space that this encompasses for the next, say, 10, 20 years? What would you like to see happen?
Oh, I love this question. So, I am a therapist, and I do believe very deeply in both therapy and in psychedelic assisted therapy. But actually, my real dream is that we work towards a dual model of having affordable access to clinical treatments with psychedelics, and that we also have community treatment, a community care model. And what that would look like for me is that we live to see a day in the not far off future where psychedelics are decriminalized. And if a person chooses to go in a medical context with a therapist to have treatment, they have that accessible to them. But what I would also love to see is a decriminalized world where communities, particularly traditionally oppressed communities, can come together to create healing rituals that are specific to their own needs. So as a queer person, what that might look like for me is intergenerational healing circles that could encompass music, that it could encompass mutual support, storytelling. I have this vision that people could come together and actually safely use these medicines and support each other in their own healing outside of the context of therapy as well. Because we just have hundreds of years of knowing that people can safely do that if you empower them. That the biggest risks around that kind of clinical, or not clinical intervention, around pleasure-based intervention, I guess you would say, are the legal ones, right? Or the potential legal ramifications for people. These medicines can be done safely and with the right kind of oversight. And of course, there's going to be people that this isn't a good fit for. And there are folks who should probably not take psychedelics because of pre-existing mental health conditions, because of, I'm not sort of promoting the idea that this is safe for everyone, but we do know that with proper preparation and screening, there's no reason why we can't have broad applications even outside of the clinical arena for people to be able to use these medicines to heal.
Yeah.
So that's what I would really love to see.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like an extraordinary vision to create for all of us, to make it an all-in effort, that it's not just something that happens in this sort of siloed private context that therapy is often done in this very sort of secret squirrel way, which of course, confidentiality matters, but for this sort of stuff to be more, as you say, at a community level, would also, I think, shift a lot of the stigma and the difficulty that people have in talking about some of these complicated feelings, is when it's more normalized, more accessible, and the community is more involved. And by community, I don't mean like everybody, but your chosen family, chosen circle, chosen people to be your support network. So now I know for absolute certain that there are people who are listening to this who are like, let me at this Dee. I want to get to know them more about them. So I, of course, will be putting links to your website in the show notes. And for people, lay people and or clinicians who are listening, you at times offer training programs through various institutions in New York. Are they also accessible to people in other countries? Can they take them online, or is it only for American clinicians?
I don't know about any kind of continuing ed credits that could be transferred internationally, but certainly, in the age of COVID, all of my classes have gone online. So I'll be teaching a course called High Impact, an exploration of psychedelics in society and research for sex therapists and educators. That'll be in April, and you can sign up for that through Anti-Up. We can also put that in the show notes if you'd like. And that's going to be specifically around psychedelics and sexuality, but with a lot of emphasis on the research of women, trans people, queer folks, Black and Indigenous perspectives, and really looking at how the drug war and capitalism has influenced all of this. So that class is coming up, but I always have sort of teaching and presentations going on. So
yeah, you do.
You can always get in touch with me, and feel free to take any of my classes as they come.
And for folks, again, listening who think that they would be interested in learning from Dee, I highly encourage you to do that, because I've taken one of your classes and it was fantastic. And your knowledge, Dee, is just above and beyond. You're able to hold space for such extraordinary, diverse groups of people, from, medical professionals through to counselors and therapists, and also just people who have an interest in this stuff. You're across everything. You're fluent in multiple languages, and that makes it just such a joy to be in your company and to learn from you. And with that, Dee, I appreciate you joining me here on The Erotic Philosopher, and I can't wait to see you in person at some point very soon, I hope.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
I hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Dee Goldpaugh and understood more about the relationship between healing and psychedelics and the complexity that it is in its space that it takes up, where we're mixing in, the politics and the legislation of recreational drugs in contrast with the things that we understand culturally and socially about who gets to access such medicines, such support, and who doesn't. And also, if you've been listening to The Erotic Philosopher for some time, you've probably noticed that I will often critique psychotherapy in the same breath as saying that it's effective and fantastic. And that may cause some of you to think, is she for psychotherapy or is she against it? The answer is I'm both and neither. My original training, as many of you know, was in traditional psychotherapy, and for many years I practiced as a psychotherapist. And these days my work is exclusively in sex and relationships. And while obviously I bring my training, my psychotherapeutic training, into my sex and relationships work, and it has enabled me to develop the skills to be able to hold space for people energetically and emotionally, these are skills that are required of a competent psychotherapist to be able to integrate what clients bring cognitively, their thoughts, and energetically and emotionally into sessions. Where I do become critical, I guess, of psychotherapy is that I think at times it really doesn't go deep enough, and sometimes it just completely misses the mark, especially with regards to the wisdom of the body, especially with regards to the wisdom of, in this case, as Dee was explaining, plant medicine. Dee's position on this is that they help people integrate the things that they experience during working with different kinds of medicine, or as they were saying, ketamine, which is not necessarily medicine, it's a synthetic substance. But regardless of your position on the role of traditional psychotherapy in contrast with somatic therapies and or psychedelic therapies and all of the alternative or so-called alternative therapies, what is crucial, I think, and this is just my opinion, is that we are able to hold multiple points of inquiry and hold multiple truths at once. The danger of narrowing a story down to one single thing, or saying that one thing is the one true path, limits us in our capacity to be able to hold the complexity of the human experience, to hold the complexity of human sexuality. And I would love to hear what you think about this and your experiences of psychedelic therapies, somatic therapies, traditional psychotherapy, and how you see them intersect. Let me know. One of the ways you can let me know is by following us on social media. We are at The Erotic Philos, that's PHILOS, on Instagram and Twitter. You can also follow me, Cindy Darnell, CYNDI_DARNELL on Instagram and Twitter. And what I would really love is if you took a couple of minutes to leave a review for us on iTunes. Head to my website, cindydarnell.com, and you'll see the home of The Erotic Philosopher there. There's a link to leave your review on iTunes, where your reviews and ratings help boost our visibility and enable people just like you to find us and get the information that they're looking for with regards to deepening their understanding of sex, pleasure, therapy, psychedelics, and all the good stuff that we talk about here on The Erotic Philosopher. And speaking of good stuff, my book, Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire, is out in June of 2022. If you haven't already ordered it yet, or pre-ordered it, or back-ordered it, depending on when you're listening to this episode, while you're hanging out on my website, check out the book tab there. You'll see a link to order the book online from anywhere you are in the world. While you're on my website, consider hanging out at the Online Pleasure School. There are a suite of pre-recorded classes there covering some of the most important things people need to know about sex and relationships in video and audio classes, ready for you to take in the privacy of your own home from anywhere in the world. And if you need extra support in integrating what you discover by listening to The Erotic Philosopher or taking the online classes, you can also reach out to me for counseling, coaching, and therapy. I work with individuals, couples, polygroups, and beyond, and provide support to people who seek more from their sex and relationships' lives, because it is complicated and it is tough, and feeling alone is never fun. Thank you for joining me for another episode of The Erotic Philosopher. I love being here with you. I love whispering in your ear and sharing my guests with you. And I look forward to connecting with you next time. Until then, take care.